But tonight's webinar really stems from an outstanding piece that Herb wrote just 12 days ago about the outbreak of the Second Intifada, which happened literally 20 years ago to this day. You know, why did it erupt? Why was it so cruel and costly? What have been its implications? It clearly traumatized Israeli society. All Israelis, civilians and all, felt this right to the bones, right to the kishkas. Everyone was affected, and it's had profound consequences for Israel, for its society, for its politics, for the views of the Palestinians, and basically the feeling that there hasn't been a partner on the other side since then. A feeling, of course, that's reinforced when Israelis look at the behavior of Hamas in recent years, and even the rhetoric and to some extent the behavior of the Palestinian Authority to this day, even though Israelis are clearly still committed to peace, still committed to a two-state outcome, providing there's an end to the conflict. And they still feel that where is that partner? And this is all very ironic at a time when we see a sea change in the Middle East, where the region is on the verge of dramatic positive change, which we see in the normalization agreements with the UAE and Bahrain and all the implications of that. So Israeli politics, we've seen, have also been affected in terms of the turn to the right in the last 20 years, the slow decline of the Labour Party. And there's nobody better really to try and navigate our way through the Intifada, through its consequences, and to an analysis of where we are today, in large part because of it, than our guest of honor tonight, Herb Keinon. So Herb, the screen is yours. Please tell us all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Colin. Thank you. Thanks. Good evening to you, live from my living room outside of Jerusalem. Look, in Israel, as you know, we go both by a Gregorian calendar and by the Jewish calendar, by a calendaric quirk, calendaric, if that's a word. Yesterday marked, as Colin said, the anniversary of two watershed events in Israeli history. It was Yom Kippur. So on the Jewish calendar, this marked 47 years since the 1973 Yom Kippur War, a defining event that shaped Israel for generations. It was also September 28th, the 20th anniversary of a 4-year, 5-month terror war against Israel known as the Second Intifada. And that too was also a defining moment, a watershed event in Israeli history. And it's also shaped a generation and will shape future generations as well. Since Israel is in the midst right now of its next defining moment, how it deals with COVID-19, both the anniversary of the Yom Kippur War and the anniversary of the Second Intifada were played down, didn't get as much print as they might have in a normal year. But that shouldn't be the case. Most people who understand history, most people who know Israeli history, understand the long-term impact that the Yom Kippur War had on Israel. But what I think is less appreciated, especially by those who don't live here, is the significance that the Second Intifada has had on the country. And it's had incredible significance. To understand Israel today, to understand so much of what the country does, to understand its political turn to the right, why it has voted time and time again for Benjamin Netanyahu, why it has no confidence right now in the Palestinians, why it seems indifferent to the stalemate in the Palestinian diplomatic track. To understand that is to understand the strain and the pressure that everyone in this country encountered or labored under during that period in the Intifada from September 2000 to February 2005, when it kind of petered out. The Second Intifada, which was hatched by Yasser Arafat after the failed Camp David summit just 2 months previous in July of 2000, and triggered by Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount, his tour of the Temple Mount, is still resonating today, right? Israel changed fundamentally as a result of the Second Intifada. Israel today, in September of 2020, is not the same Israel that was back in August or early September of 2000. How do I know this? Why do I say this? First of all, I live here. I've lived in this country for a long time. I kind of got a certain sense of what has changed. But secondly, I look at how people vote, right? I look at how people vote. You noticed that we in this country, we go to elections quite a bit. Since 1999, the year before the Intifada, Israel has had 10 different elections, 10 elections since 99. The right, if you look at what happened in those elections, the right won 6 of those. It tied 1, the last one in March of 2020. The center won 1 election, and it tied another one back in September of 2019. And the left hasn't won an election since Ehud Barak in 1999. 10 elections, the right wins 6, the center wins 1, the left hasn't won 1 since 1999. More than that, more telling than that, is the fact that in the elections of 1992, when Yitzhak Rabin beat Yitzhak Shamir right before the Oslo Accords, in those elections, the 2 left-wing Zionist parties, Labor and Meretz together, won 56 out of the 120 Knesset seats, right? That's a lot. That's almost a majority. In the last elections in March, those 2 same parties who ran together with another small party named Gesher, those parties together won only 7 seats. So you, in the span of from 1993 up until 2020, a span of 27 years, Labor Meretz dropped from 56 to 7 seats. Why? What happened? Israelis gave up wanting peace with the Palestinians. They gave up on wanting to finally put this thing to rest. They gave up on a willingness to accommodate with the Palestinians. No, what happened was simply the country was mugged by reality. It was mugged by reality. It was mugged by a mind-numbing terrorism that made it scary to ride a bus, that made it nerve-wracking to send your kids on a bus to school, that made it a psychological effort to take the family downtown Jerusalem to get a falafel, right? Everyone during this 4.5 year period, everyone who rode a bus eyed their fellow passengers warily, especially if he was wearing a jacket on a hot summer day, worried that underneath the jacket, he had a suicide, he had a bomb belt, and he was gonna blow up the entire bus. Look, I've lived in Israel for a long time now. I've lived in Israel for some 38 years. I lived through the first Intifada and the second Intifada, the first Lebanon War and the second Lebanon War, the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War, and a number of campaigns into Gaza. And believe me, the most difficult period that I ever felt here, the most tense, strained period, was that period of the Second Intifada from 2000 to 2005. This harrowing period fundamentally altered Israeli society, and it did so because it impacted everybody. Everybody felt it. Nobody was immune. Israelis were well acquainted with security challenges before September 2000, obviously, right? I mean, this wasn't the first time we've had a security problem in this country. But for the most part, back then, there was a strong sense of personal security in the cities. You didn't want to go roaming around the borders, perhaps. You didn't want to go traipsing around the Palestinian cities in the West Bank. You might be a little wary of walking around, not knowing where you're going in East Jerusalem. But there was a sense of being safe at home, in the streets, in the cinemas, in the hotels, and in the restaurants. That's what we had before the Second Intifada. Some 1,053 Israelis were killed in terrorist acts from September 2000 to February 2005 in the streets, in the cinemas, in the hotels, and in the restaurants, right? And if you put that in Australian terms, if you put it in per capita, you do the calculations, that would be similar to some 3,113 Australians being killed in a 4-year period in terror attacks. And what this did for Israelis is it changed in their mind the whole equation of what is and what's not secure, right? That whole idea of where security is and what security is was completely flipped on its head by this wave of terrorism. Let me give you a personal example. Look, I made Aliyah. I immigrated to Israel in my early 20s. So when I came here, I did a truncated army service of about 6 months. But then every year I did reserve duty. I was a combat medic in the reserves. I did 15 years of reserve duty, which means that every year for a month, I'd be called up into the reserves. And my unit was attached to either the northern border of Lebanon or the Syrian border. So whenever I get these call-up notices, the way it works in Israel is before you go in, you get a call-up notice about a month in advance. So you have you have time to get everything in order so you can leave work and your family for a month. I get these call-up notices, right? And I'd get nervous. I get nervous because they're sending me to the borders. Things happen on borders, right? Terrorists infiltrate through borders. Rockets fall on borders. I come from Denver, Colorado. I don't come from a great military background. My father, God bless him, he was in the Air Force during the Korean War. He was a clerk typist stationed in Long Beach, California. And I remember as a kid, he used to tell us that when the enemy came, he backspaced. So that's the military lore that I was raised on. The last time I went into Miluim was in March of 2002. March of 2002 was the absolute worst month of terrorism Israel ever faced. This was the month of the Park Hotel Passover Eve massacre. 130 people were killed in 1 month. You got to put that in context. This year, 2 people have been killed the entire year. This was a horrible, horrible month. And I was up on the Syrian border. I was stationed in a little outpost just across the border in no man's land. And I remember thinking at the time, I was in this outpost. I was ringed by tanks. Right? I was in a bunker. I was hunkered down in a bunker. I had on a flak jacket. I had on a helmet. I had on a rifle, right? I felt secure. I felt secure. I was worried about my teenage daughter at the time who had to take a bus from where we lived outside Jerusalem to go to school in Jerusalem. And that's how the security equation changed for everybody, everybody felt it. Everybody felt it. This was not something that was happening out there beyond the water's edge somewhere else. This was happening in your neighborhood. This was happening to people you know, right? And it left a huge mark. I'll give you another example just of how everybody felt it. I live in an average apartment building. Nothing unique about this apartment building. There's 12 units in my apartment. The person I bought my apartment from was killed in a drive-by shooting during this period. First cleaning woman we ever had. An immigrant from Russia was killed in a suicide bombing in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem. Next door neighbor's nephew was hurt badly in an attack in Petach Tikva near Tel Aviv. Upstairs neighbor's nephew was a soldier. He was killed in Hebron. A co-worker of mine at the Jerusalem Post was hurt badly trying to get to work at the Post on a bus, right? This just illustrates that the terror was real. It was immediate. It affected everybody and it colored everything and it continues to color things, right? The trauma of that period remains. And anytime we have rockets going off or terror attacks or stabbings, it kind of reignites that trauma. Time may have dulled the intensity of the trauma, but it has in no way erased it. The longevity, this war went on for 4 years and 5 months. The longevity of it, the intensity, the brutality of it, right, is something that seeped very deep into the Israeli consciousness. More Israelis were killed in the Second Intifada than were killed in the Sinai campaign in '56, the Second Lebanon War, or even the Six-Day War in 1967, right? That seeped into how people see things. The terror was, as I said, was everywhere. It crept into everything and it shaped how people look and continue to look at the world, at the government, what the government should do, what risks the government can and should be willing to take. So to truly understand today, 20 years later, you need to understand how this country views the diplomatic process with the Palestinians and how this country votes or who this country votes for. Why time and time again it votes for Netanyahu. It's important to understand the trauma of that period because I think to a large extent that explains a lot, right? Let's take Netanyahu, for instance. Netanyahu has been prime minister now for some 14 and a half years, right? Or more than 20% of Israel's entire history. That's an astounding figure, by the way. If you put that in American terms, it's like having one president for about 45 or 46 years, right? Imagine President Trump, President Obama for 45 or 46 years. What's amazing about Netanyahu is that he continues to win, right? And the polls show that if elections were held today, he would come up on top again today. He might not be able to form a coalition, right? Because of the enmity that he's created with all these other parties, but he would come up on top again. And what's amazing about that is that happens despite the fact that Netanyahu is not a beloved figure in this country. He never touched the country at a visceral level the way Menachem Begin did, right? He was always seen kind of as an outsider, raised in America, somebody, wealthy, lives in Caesarea. It wasn't one of the people like Begin was seen. Despite the fact that the country hates his wife, despite the fact the country can't stand his kid, despite the fact that he's not under indictment, he's on trial for 3 counts of corruption, right? He continues to win. Why? One of the reasons is because he's been able, the major reason in my mind, and this is in the context of the Second Intifada, is he's been able to create the sense that when he's in power, you're safer. When he's in power, the chances of a bus going up with your kid on it are a lot less, right? He's created this perception that he's Mr. Security, and when he's there, there's less terrorism. Now, I found this kind of thesis kind of interesting, so I wanted to check it. Is it true? Is it true? And what's interesting is the numbers bear this out. The numbers bear this out. In the last 10 and a half years since he's been in power, coming to power in April 2009, an average of 14 Israelis have been killed each year in terrorism, 14, right? If you take the 9 years previous to that, from 2000 to 2009, including the years of the Intifada, right? In 1 year of the Intifada in 2002, 454 Israelis were killed. If you take that 9-year period, an average of 130 Israelis were killed. So you got 14 versus 130. People say, well, that's not fair. You're comparing the Second Intifada, horrible terrorism, to period afterwards when it's quiet. So you can say, okay, so let's look at Netanyahu's first term from 96 to 99. 96 to 99, an average of 20 Israelis were killed each year by terrorism. The 3 years previous under Rabin and Shimon Peres, right? In the heyday of the Oslo period, during that period, 58 Israelis were killed. So you got 20 versus 58, you got 14 versus 130. Now, Israelis don't know those figures. People don't walk around with those grisly statistics in hand, but they know it in their gut because they remember what happened during the Intifada, because that trauma remains with them. And this, in my mind, is a major component behind why Netanyahu continues to win, right? Because we came out of the Intifada. It's all framed by the Intifada. The lack of personal security of the Second Intifada has allowed him to present himself, right, as Mr. Security. Mr. Security. Look, I'm not the only genius who realizes this, right? The party that ran against him in the last elections, blue and white, they also realized it, which is why they figured the way to beat Mr. Security is to get not one former chief of staff on the ticket, not 2 former chiefs of staff, but 3 former chiefs of staff, right, on the blue and white ticket. And they still didn't beat him. They still didn't beat him. So putting this within the context of the Second Intifada, I think that's one of the main reasons that Netanyahu has had such lasting staying power. In addition to having an impact on Netanyahu's successes, the electoral successes of Netanyahu, the Intifada, which was, like I said, both a physical and a psychological trauma, it disabused many Israelis of the idea that you're going to be able to reach an agreement with the Palestinians at all. And it created a sense in the minds of millions of Israelis that there's simply nobody on the other side to talk to. Why? Because the worst violence, the worst terror violence Israel ever experienced came after it gave the Palestinians control over large swaths of the West Bank and Gaza, after it allowed Arafat back into the territories, after Ehud Barak at Camp David gave the Palestinians the most generous offer an Israeli prime minister had given up until that time. It was improved since then by Ehud Olmert, right? Barak offered 95% of the West Bank and Gaza, dividing Jerusalem in half, and that still wasn't enough for the Palestinians. As a result of that, as a result of the fact that the horrible violence came after Israel offered as much as it did, after it went that step towards the Palestinians, as a result of that, even Israelis, I think, who were very supportive of the Oslo process, began to doubt the feasibility of the process, right? They still wanted peace, but they doubted whether right now it's feasible with the Palestinians. If they would not accept the most generous offer that a left-wing, the last left-wing Israeli prime minister ever had, if they wouldn't accept that offer at Camp David, there was still a gap between the most a left-wing Israeli would give and the minimum requirements of Yasser Arafat, then the idea, I think, that took hold among many people is that they're just not going to accept anything. And I think that that notion still remains very much in people's mind. Another lesson I think many Israelis took from the Intifada was that if you do not control the territory, you can't fight terrorism. Right? Remember, Second Intifada happened after Israel let the PLO, let the Palestinian Authority back into the territory, back into the West Bank, back into Gaza. And once inside those areas, Israel wasn't there, the soldiers moved back, they were able to develop a terrorist infrastructure. And it was from this terrorist infrastructure that they were able to develop the means to carry out what they carried out during that 4.5 year terror war. So one of the takeaways that many had is that you got to be in the territory, right? And the terrorism only started to drop after March 2002, after the Park Hotel massacre in Netanya on Seder night, right? When Ariel Sharon finally decided it's time to go back into the cities, only when the IDF started to go back into the Palestinian territories, were you able to bring the terrorism down. This is a notion, again, the idea that you have to have territory to prevent this kind of terrorism is something that I think was a takeaway from the Second Intifada. It's also something that many Israelis realize now, watching what's going on in Gaza, right? I mean, Gaza, they decide when they want to send rockets over to Israel, when they want to send inflammable balloons. One of the reasons is because you're not inside the territory. The Intifada, I think, also hammered home to Israelis the realization that security had to be in your hands, that you couldn't parcel it out, right? Under Oslo, there was going to be cooperation with the Palestinians. It didn't work. I think many Israelis are also disabused of the idea that anybody but them can control security, because if it's not in your hands, it's not in your hands. Another point I would make regarding the impact of the Intifada is that paradoxically, it kind of cured Israelis of a paralyzing fear of another Intifada, right? It cured Israelis of a fear of another Intifada. Now, what does that mean? It means that Israelis, for the most part, believe that this Intifada ended in February of 2005, not because anything the Palestinians did, right? Not because they stopped it on their own volition, not because the Palestinian Authority police went in there and put a stop to it, but it stopped because the IDF got control of the situation. The IDF, the Shabak, the security services, they're the ones who put an end to the Intifada. It was not as if the Palestinians decided to stop blowing us up, but rather we became all the more adept at being able to stop them from doing that, right? And that, I think that's an important takeaway from how Israelis view the Intifada, that we defeated it, they didn't stop it. And why is that significant? It's significant because it means that the Israeli public, as much as they, God forbid, don't want another Intifada, right? They're not necessarily that afraid of it. I mean, they're afraid of it, but it's not something that makes you quake in your boots. Often we see that the Palestinians are always threatening, if you don't do this, there's going to be if you do this, there's going to be a third Intifada. They said it after the U.S. moved the embassy to Jerusalem. They said it with all the talk of annexation of the West Bank. But to a certain degree, I think this is a hollow threat, because Israelis, to a large degree, I believe, think, you know what? We dealt with it. It was awful. It was bad. We paid a price. They paid a much heavier price. The country survived. The country actually got stronger as a result of it. It was resilient, showed great resilience. And so a third Intifada, it's horrible, it's bad, but it's not something that's necessarily going to force the public, to force the government to do things that the government doesn't think it can do for the country's security. Allow me just one last point before we open it up for questions, and that has to do with the region, right? Because the region also watched how Israel dealt with the Intifada. And the regional element here, I think, is very important, because the Intifada happened 5 months after Israel hastily left Lebanon. Some would say Israel ran away from Lebanon, right? 5 months after that, you had the start of the Intifada. And I think you can connect the dots. The day after Israel left Lebanon, Nasrallah, right? Hussein Nasrallah, Hezbollah's Nasrallah in Lebanon, he gave a famous speech called the Spiderweb speech, right? This is the day after Israel left Lebanon in the middle of the night. And he said that Israel is like a spider web, right? It's like a spider web. You can blow it. If you blow on it hard enough, it's just going to disappear. And I think what the withdrawal from Lebanon, the way it was done, it created a certain perception among our enemies that Israel is not as strong as it looks on paper, right? And the fact that they left Lebanon like it did proved that. Nasrallah's speech showed to the degree to which he believed that. And I think to a large extent, Arafat also picked up on this. He definitely saw what happened in Lebanon. I think to a large extent, he thought that he could duplicate that in the West Bank. But thank God he was mistaken, right? Because the Intifada also sent a message, the way Israel finally brought it down, the message being that you can push Israel so far, you can push it, but at a certain point, there's a certain line where Israel's it's gonna push back, and it's gonna push back very hard. So I think that's a message that the manner in which we brought down the Intifada, that's a message that I think sent out to the region. So again, just to sum up, this is an event that's had a huge impact on our society and decision-making process, and also how everybody in the region looks at us as well. I'd be happy to take questions about that or anything else that might be on your mind.
Thank you very much, Herb, for that very comprehensive analysis. I appreciate it. Now, look, I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, that you do have questions. Just a reminder to use the raised hand feature inside Zoom. You will see a participant button. You can click that at the bottom of the participant list. You will see an option to raise your hand. You can also submit your question in the chat feature, and we'll attempt to get to it. Now, I might kick us off. Herb, you discussed about the trauma and the impact that the Second Intifada had on Israeli society from multiple angles. Now, 20 years on, there's an entirely new generation in Israel that were too young to remember the Second Intifada and Palestinian terrorism at its peak. What do you think that it is that, in spite of the passage of time and relative calm conditions, that Israel's left wing has failed to cultivate enthusiasm for a rejuvenated peace camp among young voters?
Hey, look, and that's a good question, Joel. Because I think that the bill of goods that the left has been trying to sell since then, it just doesn't resonate. And what's that bill of goods? That if we just give up more, right, then there'll be peace. That if Israel just makes concessions, and that there's going to be a Palestinian on the other side who's going to be willing to take their concessions and give concessions on their own, and peace is going to flow like a river. And I think the history, even since the Intifada, has shown that that's just not the case. I mean, look, the Intifada was a trauma. A couple months after that trauma, we had another trauma, and that was the trauma of the withdrawal from Gaza, right? The evacuation of 10,000 settlers, 21 settlements in the Gaza Strip, essentially doing what the Palestinians had been asking us to do for years, what the world has been pressing on Israel to do. We left Gaza. And what do we get as return for leaving Gaza? We got the worst terrorism from Gaza that we've ever faced. So that too kind of disabused people the notion that it's all in our hands. All we have to do is give up more, and they're going to receive it, and we're going to have peace. And we haven't seen anything since then that the Palestinians have done to change that mood, right? Neither in actions nor in rhetoric. So I think that's why the left is having such a difficult time right now gaining traction, because that message and the reality that we face, it just doesn't resonate with people.
Thank you for that. I'll now hand over to Gary Hertz.
G'day, Herb.
Hi, Gary.
So I wanted to ask you something on a micro level to do with the Intifada and the victims of it. Close to home, there is Malki Roth was murdered during this Intifada. I think it was in 2000. And her murderer, the one who planned it, Tamimi, was released with the exchange with Shalit. The Roths, especially in recent times, have been trying to put a lot of pressure on the American, not pressure, try to bring justice to this case, and have been seeing and speaking to congressmen in the United States to try to get them to pressure Jordan, which Israel's got a cold peace with, to extradite her. How do you see this playing out in the States, and particularly in relation to Israel? Will they be doing it without Israel's backing on that because of this cold peace and because of the release of Shalit, the deal?
Look, I mean, the way this is being played out is between the Roth family and the Americans. I mean, the Americans are the ones who have leverage on the Jordanians. We don't have that leverage. I know that there's been a very active campaign to get the Americans, to get Congress on board here. I think if Trump wins in November, right, then that could have some kind of impact. Because if Trump wins in November, and the administration says that this is important to them, then the Jordanians, who rely to a huge degree on American support and assistance, right, will probably end up playing ball. The Biden administration too. I mean, if they come into power and this is something that has a groundswell of support in Congress, they could also make it an issue. But that's where I think the Roths are doing something wisely. That's where you want to pressure. You can't pressure us where we don't have that kind of leverage with the Jordanians like the Americans do.
Thank you, Herb. We'll now go to Dr. Ron Peratt.
Thank you, Joel. I don't know if you see me quite well because of my other problems with my camera. So maybe I'll just close my camera if that's possible. That's okay because my camera really is not. It's not good.
Ask the question, Ron. We've got you there. You've now muted yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go for it, Ron.
Sorry for technical problems. I was there that night of Leila Seder, the massacre at Park Hotel. I was on duty as an intelligence officer. I remember very clearly the shock of both sides, by the way, the Palestinians and the Israelis, when Operation Defense Shield started. And my impression was, from that point onward, that Israel has decided not only to stop trusting the Palestinians, but also take unilateral steps. And you can see Operation Defense Shield to take down the Palestinian Authority in its previous format. Then the wall, later on the disengagement plan, etc. So do you think that's the moment that the idea that the Palestinians, by the way, also remember that Intifada, that's something to note as a trauma, a big trauma. They don't want to repeat. But do you think it's the moment that both peoples decided that the previous formats for peace have died, and there needs to be either a different way or just sort of moving from a conflict resolution to conflict management?
Look, as far as the Palestinians go, I think you see an interesting trajectory, right? In 1993, Arafat decides that he's got his goals, right? His goals are Palestinian state, he's choosing the capital, refugees, whatever. What he's done up until 93 hasn't worked. It hasn't moved him to his goals. He's going to talk with the Israelis. So he starts negotiating with the Israelis. That's Oslo. We talk for 7 years. At Camp David, right, what he sees that the most that a left-wing Israeli prime minister is willing to give him doesn't meet his minimum requirements. He realizes he can't get any more from Israel by talking to them. So if you can't get what you want by talking to them, but you still want what you want and you're not willing to compromise on it, then you do another tactic. And what was that tactic? That tactic was to just bam Israel in the face, right? Bloody their nose, and then they will give you what they want. Thank God, from our perspective, that didn't work, right? So in 2005, Abu Mazen is at the same crossroads. You talked, that didn't get you what you want. You did violence, that didn't get you what you want. So you got to start a new tactic. And what's the tactic that he adopted very much was kind of diplomatic pressure on Israel, isolate Israel, make Israel into pariah state, turn the world against Israel, and that'll force Israel to give you, or get America, get the Europeans to pressure Israel to give you what you want. That didn't work, right? And I think right now we're at a crossroads, because I think what the recent peace deals with the UAE and Bahrain have shown is that really didn't work, because even the Arab countries are not willing to isolate Israel anymore. So I think yes, I think the Intifada showed the power. I think it was a tactic that failed. They adopted another tactic which failed, and now I think they're going to be looking for another tactic. As far as Israel, I think you're 100% correct. I think one thing that this slammed into the Israeli consciousness is that this whole idea, right, this kind of illusion that we have that one day we're going to wake up and there's going to be a peace agreement, that a conflict of 100 years, religious nationalism, is going to disappear by the stroke of a pen. That ain't going to happen, right? Conflict resolution was too high a bar. And then maybe the way to do it, until things change on the ground, you might not be able to resolve the conflict, but you can manage it better. So I think that is something that did inculcate to a large degree into the Israeli consciousness. Forget resolving it, but let's try to manage it better. But in order to manage it better, you need two sides, right? You need the Palestinians as well. And anytime, sometimes we get close to maybe coming to some kind of modus vivendi, some kind of management, you'll see rockets flying at us from Gaza, because there are forces out there in the world who don't want us to be able to manage the conflict, right? Foremost, Iran, the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, etc.
Thank you, Herb. We'll now go to Dr. Zvi Fleischer.
Good evening. Good morning with you, Herb. Thank you very much. I want to ask you a little bit about the situation of the accords in Israel. I think that the Bahrain, the Abraham Accords, they seem like real game changers. There's a lot of benefit. I mean, I think to some extent you could say the Israeli dream of being accepted as part of the region is starting to come true. But how much has, two questions, I guess. How much has the coronavirus and the political instability in Israel dampened sort of the ability of Israelis to appreciate the magnitude of this potential breakthrough? And on top of the benefits, do you see any possible downsides or risks involved in these accords?
Look, as far as how Israelis, accepted this thing, unfortunately, the ceremony on the White House lawn came at a time when, Israel is very mired in its the failures it's had in dealing with the coronavirus. So it wasn't in a great partying mood. The country wasn't in the mood for a big party. That being said, I think most people realize that, okay, the coronavirus is here and it's bad, but eventually, please God, it's going to go away. These accords are something that's very significant, and they're going to stay with us. Look, on the hard left, there will be people who just, will try to downplay the accords, not necessarily because they're opposed to the accord, but rather they're opposed to the person who brought the accord, right? You heard people saying, well, the UAE and Bahrain, they're not democratic countries, as if Jordan and Egypt were Jeffersonian democracies, right? Or, you haven't been at war with Bahrain or UAE, so it's not that big a deal. Excuse me, it is a big deal because they completely isolated us in the region. I read somebody said it, I think summed it up pretty well. I mean, these people on the left, on the hard left, who were using these sour grape arguments, he said, look, let's say that you are expecting a package, right? Somebody's going to deliver a package to your home. And the guy who comes to your home to deliver the package, he's unshoveled and he doesn't smell good and he looks bad, right? Are you not going to like what's in the package because of the guy who delivered it, right? That's very kind of short-sightedness. So I think you had a bit of that. The anti-Bibyists, are not going to want to give Netanyahu credit for anything, even if what he does deserves credit. And I think here, what he did definitely deserves credit. Is there a downside to the accords? Look, these accords are, something Israel has longed to be accepted. We as Jews, we always want to be accepted, to be liked. This is something that we dreamt about. If there's a downside, it's what they're going to get in return, not necessarily from us. I mean, you could argue the debate about whether it was a good thing that Israel shelved annexation for this, it was a bad thing, but let's not even go there. The whole thing with the F-35, the sales that the U.S. is going to sell the F-35s to the UAE, is that going to change Israel's qualitative military advantage? Personally, I don't think so, right? I think whatever the UAE gets 7 years down the line, will have different technology to be able to deal with it, right? For me, that's not a major game changer. But there are people who say, well, is it if it hurts our qualitative military advantage, that's a bad thing. I don't see that happening. Another downside, perhaps, is that maybe this started a race, right? There's going to be other countries who are going to want to get in on this, perhaps, right? And they're going to expect things from the U.S. And the question is, does what they expect from the U.S., could that pose any danger to Israel? But again, I mean, I think Israel's eyes are wide open, and I think the U.S. is not going to want to do anything either that's necessarily going to endanger Israel's security. So, when you balance it off here, I think, the advantages of this thing, which are enormous, in that it changes the region and it strengthens this whole camp of stability in the region. It takes the whole teeth out of the argument that you can't do anything with the region unless you have peace with the Palestinians. I think that far, far outweighs any downside to the accord.
Thank you, Herb. I'd now like to hand over to Anthony Cohen.
Thank you, Herb, for your enlightening summary. Right from the start, the Palestinians have always been able to rely on both tacit, direct and indirect support from the European countries and the European Union. Given and to a large extent, that's possibly been because of their dependence on the Arab oil, especially from the Gulf region, to some extent North Africa. Given these changed circumstances in those areas, and the fact that both Kosovo and Serbia have made a move to set up embassies in Jerusalem, do you believe that the European support for the Palestinians will change? And if so, what effect that will have?
I mean, you raise a good point, because I think what the European Union has done over the years is kind of create this illusion among the Palestinians that they will be able to deliver Israel, right? That if you sanction settlements, if you have labels, if you don't allow Israel to certain programs, this will create a certain critical mass that will force Israel to take certain steps. I think the EU, to a certain degree, has raised this expectation. I think you have to differentiate between the EU as the European Union coming out of Brussels and the European countries, right? The 28 or 27 states now that make up the EU, because there's a big difference, right? The EU, the bureaucrats in Brussels, they have a certain very pro-Palestinian outlook that they've been working according to for years. But the countries are different, right? And this is something, again, Netanyahu, I think, deserves credit for finding an opening here and being able to create sub-alliances inside the EU in order to dampen, to tamper the criticism, the condemnations coming out of Brussels. Right? We saw this very clearly after the US moved its embassy to Jerusalem, and the EU, Brussels, wanted to put out a condemnation. They weren't able to pass it because there were a number of member states, right, mostly Eastern European countries, right, who would oppose it. It was developed a sub-alliance with the Eastern European countries, with Hungary, with Romania, with Bulgaria, with the Czech Republic, with Slovakia, also with Greece and Cyprus because of the oil. That has been very helpful for us, right? In kind of deflecting a lot of this tension, a lot of this pressure coming from the EU. That being said, I don't see the EU changing its policies. France, Germany, Spain, big countries in the EU still are kind of leading the EU's bureaucracy and where they're going on the Palestinian issue, and that's not going to change. I think it's interesting, our agreements now with the UAE and Bahrain. The EU, for the most part, since 2012, when they canceled, where a big meeting, an annual meeting between our foreign minister and the EU foreign ministers, it's called the Association Council, was canceled, and it hasn't been revived since. The EU didn't want to revive it because they linked our relations with them with our relations with the Palestinians. But now they got to look at what's going on with Bahrain and the UAE. I mean, if Bahrain and the UAE are not linking their ties to us with our ties to the Palestinians, then why should the EU? There might be some voices questioning that. By the way, India was revolutionary in this. Modi, what he did, he de-linked, he de-hyphenated India's relations with Israel. It used to be India, Israel-Palestine, Israel-Palestine. He said, no, it's going to be Israel's relations with, India's relations with India, India's relations with Israel, and India's relation with Palestine. There's not going to be a hyphen. That's what Bahrain did. That's what the UAE did. That's something that the UAE hasn't yet done. And unfortunately, considering the players who are running the show in Brussels, I don't see that happening anytime soon. And I think it's a pity, because if the Palestinians would get some kind of pressure from the EU, right, instead of the EU reflexively backing them on all their demands, that might allow them to be a bit more compromising and flexible.
Thank you for that, Herb. I'll now like to hand over to Naomi Levine.
Thanks very much, Joel, and thank you very much, Herb. Melbourne, where I am in Israel, had one thing in common, and that was Yom Kippur spent in lockdown due to coronavirus. But there seems to be very different attitudes by the population. In Melbourne, there's sort of one of compliance, whereas in Israel, it seems to be slightly different. Can you give us your take on how Israelis are reacting to this second lockdown in Israel and how you think things will pan out?
Yeah, not well. They're not reacting well. Look, there's a joke going around that a guy goes in to see his doctor and he says, "Doctor, what's going to be with the corona? When's it going to end?" And the doctor turns to him and says, "What are you asking me for? I don't understand politics." And I think to a certain degree, that's the reason the Israelis are having such a tough time with the second lockdown, because it's seen as very political. Like, the decisions are not being made necessarily, or this is the impression, the decisions aren't being made based on the merits of what's happening, but rather on pressure from one political group or the other political group. Look, there's something interesting happened. Israel did very well during the first wave. We were all very proud of it, right? We were great, and we were better than the world. It was great, right? The first wave was handled very well. What was interesting about the first wave was the first wave was handled by a transitional government. When did things start going south? On May 17th. May 17th is when they opened the buses, they opened the schools. What else happened on May 17th? The new government was sworn in. What's the connection? Because you had a new government with new ministers who wanted to please the people. And you had parents yelling to open the schools. You had wedding hall owners yelling at the politicians to open the wedding halls. And you had people who were pressing the transportation minister to open the buses and open the trains. And these ministers wanted to please the people, so they did things, right, that they shouldn't. And Israel opened up way too soon. And now today, so everything is completely politicized, right? The whole thing about Yom Kippur davening. If you close the shuls on Yom Kippur, then you have to close the protests. But if Bibi wants to close the protests, he's not really wanting to close the protests because he's worried that this is going to infect people. He's doing it because he doesn't want people to protest against him, right? So everything has a political connotation right now, which is very bad. What you need is you need an expert. Israel appointed a coronavirus czar, a guy named Gamzu, Professor Gamzu, but then the politicians didn't give him the power to do the authority to do what he wanted to. So you have a situation now when people are sitting in their homes and they're just frustrated, thinking that the decisions are not being made on their merits, but they're being made because you've got the Haredim protests or the Haredim pressuring Netanyahu on one hand, or the protesters pressuring Gantz on the other hand, and the decisions, good decisions based on what needs to be done, is just not being taken.
Thank you for Herb. As someone else from Melbourne, I can definitely understand what Israelis are experiencing right now. It seems as though that they've got a tough couple of weeks / months up ahead, but we hope that things settle down soon. I'd now like to hand over to Colin for a question.
Thanks, Joel. Questions? I'm going to abuse the offer. A couple of specific ones. Herb, Hamas, Fatah, any signs of a real agreement, or is this just more of the same with the divisions continuing? Secondly, talking about divisions, Israel's unity government, you've already given us a blast as to how it's working or not working. But what do you see in your crystal ball? How long is this going to last? What's happening? And taking your eyes off the local scene, the big picture, I have to ask, you've been reporting on Israel-China relations in the wake of the China-Iran deal, in the wake of what's happening with China and the region and globally, and it's more, let's say, aggressive posture. Is Israel rethinking its relationship with China? What do you see on that horizon?
Look, as far as Hamas and Fatah, I wouldn't bet the farm on this reconciliation agreement being more successful than the 6 other reconciliation agreements that they signed in the past. I mean, there is deep, deep, deep hatred and ideological animosity between the two groups. That's going to be very, very difficult to bridge. I saw something today, by the way, that Egypt is unhappy with the PA because the PA now is bringing Turkey and Qatar into the mix, using them as the facilitators rather than the Egyptians, and they're unhappy with that. So no, I don't see any magic wand solving the Hamas-Fatah thing because they want different things, and the hatred and the animosity there is extremely, extremely deep. As far as the unity government, what's going to be in Israel, look, it's tough. It's tough to tell. I mean, there's a date, right? Without going into insight, getting down into the weeds. Netanyahu can essentially, if he wants, trigger new elections by the end of December. You can trigger new elections if a budget isn't passed. We got past one hurdle on this, but there's a date, the end of December. If he doesn't want new elections, then there'll be a budget. If he does want new election, there won't be a budget. And the question is, what does Netanyahu want? There are those, and I tend to agree with them, who said that he could have called new elections about a month ago. He actually would have wanted to, because if he misses this one, right, if this is the last time he can do it, and then he's going to have to hand over to Benny Gantz next November. So this is his last out, his last exit. He didn't do it last time because the polls at the time, interestingly enough, they weren't shining on Gantz or even on Lapid. They were shining on Naftali Bennett from Yamina, who is to the right of Netanyahu. So what you see in the polls is you see that Likud is dropping, right? But the right wing bloc, even without Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu, the right wing bloc is rising. And what's happening is these Likud voters who are fed up with Netanyahu or what, but maybe because of annexation, they go through with annexation. They're not leaving Netanyahu and going to the center left bloc. They're leaving Netanyahu and going to Yamina, right? And we've seen now steadily for the last number of weeks, also because Bennett has come out and kind of seen and presented himself as a coronavirus maven, right? When he was defense minister, he helped very much bring down the first wave. He's seen as somebody who knows what he's doing there. He's also leveraged that to his advantage, but his poll numbers are going up. And Netanyahu is looking at that, and he's looking at the protests that are going outside of his house, and he's saying, is this the time that I want to go to the polls? Because if I do, Naftali Bennett might be the guy who will be my biggest challenge, not Benny Gantz. So I think he's trying to buy time. Come December, he's going to have to make a decision. I personally would not be surprised if we go back to elections, because in January, his trial starts in earnest 3 times a week. If he goes to the polls, he's going to want to do so before then, right? Before then rather than after, because afterwards that looks kind of bad. As far as the final question, Israel and China, look, I think on Israel and China, we're taking our lead here from the Americans. I mean, there was a lot of concern that Israel was turning over much of its infrastructure to the Chinese. This is something that the Americans very much protested. We've had a very strong relationship, as everybody knows, with the Trump administration. The one issue one of a few issues, but it's kind of been a thorn in the side has been China. The U.S. wants to see us fall more into line with them on their China policy, because we value our relationship with the Americans more than we do with the Chinese. I think you're starting to see that happen. I think Israel's argument is that our relationship with China is strictly economic. It's not strategic, and that we do business with them, and we like to continue doing business with them. The Americans just want to make sure that business doesn't entail, turning over infrastructure to them, which the Americans feel then could endanger their own security, their own intelligence needs.
Thank you for that, Herb. Now we are coming up to the hour. I will hand over to Jeremy Jones for the final question.
Thank you, Herb. Now, I have a complicated question, I suppose, or a question in more than one part. But I just want to mention also one of the discussions at the Rosh Hashanah tables around Sydney, at least, was, isn't it interesting that Israelis trust investment from the UAE as not being a security concern while they're worried about China? So that was one of the topics that chose the changed world. But one of the big questions that relates to Israel and Israel's security is how the US administration views Israel, how will it understand Israel's issues and the real Israel it is dealing with, rather than the Israel in the imagination of the various parties in America. And a question that comes to mind is, with the American election, how do you perceive there may be differences in the way the various possibilities of American leadership will understand and therefore be able to appropriately deal with Israel and its challenges? And the second question also is about a changed society. The Palestinians also had the Second Intifada 20 years ago. There's now a generation that will have seen the impact of that on their society, and you would hope that they were looking for different options, or if they want to use the same options as an intifada, they would fully understand what that might lead to. So the questions really are the American society or American government, American administrations, how they understand Israel, the real Israel, and also what the thinking might be with the Palestinians. Where do they go now, 20 years after the Second Intifada?
Okay. Look, let me start with the Palestinian question first. It's a good question. I think, I mentioned that one of the messages that the region took away from this was, if you push Israel beyond the line, they're going to react with extreme force. I think the Palestinians now also realize it as well. I think they realize that, that they, in any future conflict of this kind, they're going to lose much more than Israel, and they didn't gain anything from what they did last time. So I think, I think there's been some sobering up there. That, the idea that if you just, wage this terror war, you're going to get Israel to give you what you want. That is proven that it just doesn't work. And I think to a large extent, many Palestinians also understand that. I mean, also note that, over the last couple of years, there's been many different times when there's been calls for the Palestinians to come out in days of rage and to revolt and to start another intifada. The embassy over the U.S. moving its embassy to Jerusalem was one instance. The recent accords with Bahrain and the UAE were another instance. Every once in a while, there's something on the Temple Mount where they're talking about this will bring the people out, and the people are they're just not coming out. They're just not coming out, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think one has to do with a complete lack of trust and confidence in the Palestinian leadership. Right, the average Palestinian, right, looks where he is now, looks where he was in 1993 when this generation of leaders took over, and he sees that his position is no better. If anything, it's worse, right? Many Palestinians look at the PA as extremely corrupt, as Abu Mazen is corrupt, as a gentrified leadership who's lost all touch with the region and are just, speaking from talking points that, that they used 27 years ago at the beginning of Oslo. So there's, we talk a lot about how Israel has lost trust in its leaders. I think the Palestinian people have lost trust in their leadership, which is why they're not willing to go out and put their life on the line facing the Israeli soldiers, because they just don't trust the leaders to bring them into any new place. And the second thing that I would mention is that, I would not want to be a Palestinian. It's difficult, right? Life is difficult. I wouldn't want to be, at a checkpoint, having an Israeli soldier going through my stuff under this, horrible heat. I wouldn't want it. But I think if you would ask the Palestinians right now, as they look at the region, Damascus and Baghdad and Cairo or Amman, right? I think most of the Palestinians would tell you, right, that as far as their daily lives are concerned, even with the indignities of what's going on in the West Bank, right, their daily lives are actually better than a lot of their fellow Arabs in other Arab capitals around the world. Now, I'm not saying this in any way to kind of diminish the importance of ideology, because ideology and religion is a strong motivation for people, but it's not the only motivation, right? People also, to a certain extent, want to get on with their lives. And I think the fact that you're not seeing Palestinians come out to the streets as you have in the past at a drop of a hat when the Palestinian Authority calls for them to do so, I think that shows that there's a lack of confidence in the leadership, and just people don't want to risk what they got, not knowing if it's going to do any good. As far as the last question, this is a rather small question, the Israeli-US relations, what's going to be if Trump isn't reelected, if what's going to be under a Biden administration. Look, I mean, I understand that President Trump is a bit of a divisive figure, so I'll kind of walk gingerly around this. If you look at Israel, just Israel, divorce everything else, right? Divorce presidents, taxes, Stormy, whatever, what's her name? Stormy, whatever, right? Divorce the whole Trump package and only look at Trump towards Israel. I think most people here will tell you that Trump for Israel was good, was very good even, right? I mean, what did he do? He moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He gave us unstinting backing at the United Nations. He got out of the Iranian deal. He recognized the sovereignty of the Golan Heights. He brokered this deal with the UAE and Bahrain. Those are all good things, right, for Israel. So I think there's a recognition of that. What's going to be under a Biden administration? Now you could argue why he did all that, right? That's a different argument. But the facts on the ground that did occur under his administration, and I think the Israeli government for sure, and most Israelis to a certain degree appreciate them also realizing that he is not, he's not an angelic individual. What's going to be with Biden? Look, Biden, if you look at that whole, if you go back a year and you look at all the candidates who were on the debate stage, I think there were 17 to beginning, right? And you could pick the two best out of that group for Israel, right? I think you would have picked Biden and Harris because they come from the moderate camp of the Democratic Party, right? Biden, he doesn't agree with Bibi. He doesn't agree with the Likud's policies, but he is a supporter of Israel. He does see, he sees Israel as the good guys. There are a lot of people in that party right now who don't. Kamala Harris is also, she doesn't have the same track record that Biden does with Israel, but she also puts Israel in the camp of the good guys. But you're not going to see the same level, perhaps, of support for Israel that you have right now, because the question is going to be, to what degree will Biden's be beholden to the progressive wing of his party, to the Bernie Sanders wing of his party, the Ilhan Omar wing of the party, because they're going to want to say, a lot depends on who he appoints as his national security advisor, as his secretary of state. That being said, I think I can say with confidence now, though, that what we've seen over the last generation is that the relationship, the Israeli-US relationship, is so strong and so deep that it transcends one person, right? It transcends one person. We had a rocky relationship between Bibi and Obama, right, for 8 years. But you had strong support in Congress. You had a very, very tight security relationship. You had strong business ties. You have a population, a public opinion, which is still very supportive of Israel, right? And that's not going to dissipate no matter who comes into power. So I think that the tone of the relationship will change if Biden comes in. Although Biden has said that one thing he learned from the Obama administration is to keep your dirty laundry in private. But the overall tone, I think, will probably change. But I'm not really concerned about where the relationship goes, because we're so tightly enmeshed right now that even if it's very difficult at the top for 4 or even 8 years, it can survive that.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have time for tonight. On behalf of AIJAC, thank you very much, Herb, for your analysis tonight.